Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, programme notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. We have reached the end of season 4 of the show. Thank you as always for listening along. We'll be back in the autumn with another 10 episodes of cinematic goodness, so look out for that. And make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app of choice so you don't miss out. Also, we want to hear from you. Do you have questions, comments, complaints, or suggestions for the show? Well, you can now email them to us at podcast@klassiki.online. That's podcast@klassiki.online. So get in touch ahead of the new season. We're closing out season 4 with a look at a fascinating and misunderstood part of Ukraine, the Donbas. This resource-rich region in the east of the country was celebrated as the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, but since 2014 has become synonymous with destruction and war after more than a decade of Russian aggression and occupation. It's a region that has been subject to much controversy within Ukraine as well as internationally, but its vibrant and diverse history is too often overlooked. It's this history that Victoria Donovan has set out to capture in her fantastic new book, Life in Spite of Everything, Tales from the Ukrainian East. Victoria, who is Professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies at the University of St Andrews, draws on her extensive travel and research in Donbas to move past the clichés and give a human perspective on events. I sat down with her to discuss the book and to discuss how film has been used and abused in creating an image of the region. We've put together a playlist of some of the films discussed in this episode for Klassiki subscribers, which is linked in the show description. You'll also find plenty of links to resources and material that we touch on in the show. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon for season 5 of the Klassiki podcast. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us on the Klassiki podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So this book you've written about the Donbas, the Ukrainian East. It's a fantastic book, extremely timely, extremely inspiring and engaging, whilst also, kind of alive to this kind of horrible reality that we're currently living through. So it's great to have this opportunity to talk to you about it and to talk about cinema in the context of the east of Ukraine. I wanted to start with just a bit of context in terms of how you became interested in and how you began traveling to the Donbas, to East Ukraine. I found the links between your native Wales, your Welsh background, and Donbas really interesting, for instance. So maybe you could start by just telling us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I started working on Ukraine and on East Ukraine in particular around about 2016, when I was traveling quite frequently to Cardiff, which is the city where I'm from. And I found out about an archive that was held at the Glamorgan Archives in Leckwith in Cardiff. And it's an archive within the bigger archive, and it's called the Hughes-Ovka Research Archive. And the archive holds the documents of families from South Wales who migrated to Eastern Ukraine, today's Donbas, at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century to work in the mining and metallurgy industries there, the metal making industries. And I had no idea that this labor migration had existed at all. I didn't know about this exchange of labor and technology and expertise between South Wales and Eastern Ukraine. So I was really super fascinated by it and wanted to learn more. And it turned out that sort of a couple of hundred Welsh mining industrialists, managers, chemists, and mine workers had moved to that region from about 1869 onwards on the invitation of the then Russian Tsar, who was trying to actively develop various industries within the Russian Empire by offering foreign capitalists tax breaks, basically, to move their businesses there. So Welsh industrialists had moved at that time, and they'd moved to Donbas with this one particular figure, John Hughes, who was from Merthyr Tydfil. And John Hughes had kind of led basically a delegation of miners to the region, and sort of founded on the basis of some metallurgy works that already existed there, a company town which he called after himself, Hughesovka. John Hughes, Hughesovka.
Yeah.
In Russian, it was Yuzovka, and in Ukrainian, Yuzivka. And they lived there up until the revolution, up until 1917, when, as we know, the Bolsheviks were not fans of foreign capitalists. And so at that point, those who hadn't already left, seeing the writing on the wall, had to leave. So I should say Yuzivka was renamed after 1917 because they didn't want to keep the name of the Welsh capitalist, John Hughes, in the name of the city. So it was renamed firstly to Stalinar. And then after 1961 and de-Stalinization, it was renamed again to Donetsk. So the city is today's Donetsk. So finding out about that history was really fascinating for me in terms of opening up this kind of unknown chapter in that region's past, which had these really unexpected links to parts of the world that hadn't really been in the public eye, because that region is often talked about as kind of Russian speaking, incurably Sovietized, or it was before 2022. And now Russia obviously is kind of making this sort of toxic propagandistic claim that it's always been part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. But in fact, it's much more complicated than that, and has ties with Western Europe and America, but also all sorts of parts of the Russian Empire where labor migrants came to work in the industries there. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, obviously there's that personal connection there for you that helps to kind of bring the story to life, as it were, but it kind of sets the tone for this story you tell in the book about Donbas as this place of kind of colonial industrial policy and in kind of imperial military maneuvering, but also kind of migration, labor migration, voluntary, involuntary. It creates this image, helps to create this image of this extremely kind of active area that kind of resists lots of easy cliches or easy descriptors. And I think, as you say in the book, that the kind of the challenge in writing a history about this region is precisely that it has been subject to so many cliches up till now. And, the challenge for you is trying to write a history of it that kind of captures its character whilst swerving, or at least kind of complicating those tropes. So Donbas was, at the heart of a lot of kind of Soviet era propaganda, because it was this heavily industrialized region. And so there was a lot of kind of celebration of its industry and what that meant for kind of Soviet self-image. Since, 2014, or before that, obviously, but particularly since 2014 and 2022, it's now people in the West are suddenly aware of it as this site of, destruction and victimization, and it's kind of objectified anew, but in this other way. So, could you maybe just tell us a bit about how you tried to avoid these kind of dominant tropes about Donbas when you were writing about it, and if there was like a character that existed somewhere between those two that you discovered whilst traveling there, that you felt you needed to emphasize?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. It's a region that has quite often been at the focus of cultural stereotyping, or flattening, reductive kinds of storytelling that try and crystallize the region as just one thing, when it's very complex with these layers of history, and these sorts of entanglements that make singular storytelling about it very difficult. I was reading a lot of Soviet era kind of local history materials about Donbas, and I should say Donbas is actually quite a complicated term in itself. It's a geological term that refers to the Donetsk coal basin, but it's one that today lots of Ukrainians reject because they see it as, in that same way, reducing the region to kind of exclusively its extractivist past and its past as an extraction resource. Also, that term Donbas became kind of quite toxified politically when it was really used a lot in the propaganda of the Russian-backed separatist fighting groups in occupied Donbas. So it's a term now that carries quite a lot of baggage, and lots of people don't like to use it. But it's also a term that people from the region do continue to use to refer to home. And that's something that I talk about at the beginning of the book as well. So I handle that term with a bit of care, in the knowledge that it has all of these different kinds of associations and baggage and difficulties attached to it. But yeah, in these Soviet local history materials that I was reading when I was researching the book, you quite often encounter this formulation in Russian, because a lot of those materials were written in Russian. Что такое Donbas? Like, what exactly is Donbas? And I think almost in the asking of that question, there's the idea that this region is one thing, and that it can be sort of reduced to one thing, a sort of cultural stereotype of something. And that idea that it is one thing kind of pertains now. You can see it in kind of the Putinist propaganda of like Donbass being part of the Ruski Mir, as I already said, and not like sort of allowing space for the complexity of what this region is. So I start with that question because I think it signals how keen various kind of political and historical agents have been throughout time to define this region categorically as one thing, when in fact it is complexities, it's multiplicities.
Right.
And that's partly because this region is what the literary scholar Mary Platt would call a contact zone. It's a place where empires intersected, and therefore it's a place where you have this kind of sort of national, cultural, ethnic, linguistic diversity is built into the fabric of the society. And it's also a zone of heavy industrialization and extractivism, which means that is also a kind of something that generates diversity because of labor migration.
Right.
It's the same with a lot of heavily industrialized regions. I often compare Donbass to South Wales, where I came from, because it's not the same, but there are some similarities in the way in which the region developed historically. Because South Wales was also a heavily industrialized region, you had a lot of labor migration. For example, parts of my family are from Ireland, parts are from Italy, and they moved there because of the industries and the kind of economic factors that emerged around industry in that region. It created jobs, it created potential for and opportunities, basically.
I mean, I think that's a kind of story that people would recognize. Like,
Yeah, I
certainly,
think so.
British people, for instance, would recognize that story when
Yeah.
applied to South Wales. It's just,
Sorry, it's something that resonates not only in the UK. When I've been giving book talks abroad as well, you can always find an industrial region that kind of presents not an equivalent case, but some parallels with this region. And I
yeah,
think, industry is something we often know a lot about. It also impacts language. And so those kind of language factors, they also impacted Ukraine's East, which was Ukrainian speaking and Russian speaking, but there were also other languages present. Kind of the Mariupol Greeks spoke dialects of Greek. You had a lot of different kind of languages from the Russian Empire, and even some sort of vestiges of languages from the migration from Western Europe. So that linguistic diversity as well is part of that story. So yeah, basically, to answer your question, I wanted to try and render a lot of that complex and offer it as a kind of counter narrative to these sort of reductive imaginings of the region as just one thing, which is often the case in past propaganda and also in the propaganda that is circulating today.
and of course, I mean, not to state the obvious, but it is painfully difficult to write that history of kind of diversity and richness and complexity in the face of the destruction that is being visited on Donbas now. And I guess we can. That's something I think people are obviously aware of, and maybe we don't need to over egg that aspect. But also, I think we'll probably come back to that at some point in this discussion. Well, maybe we should start thinking or start talking now about film of the Donbas, because I think this is a really interesting question, how cinema becomes a part of this kind of placemaking, how cinema helps to create people's sense of a place. And yeah, like we were saying, Donbas was this site of huge industrialization, in the, when it was before the Soviet Union, but particularly in the Soviet Union, this idea of it as this kind of engine room for Soviet kind of industrial policy. And, it's where we get Stakhanovites, these shock workers, these kind of propagandistic, legendary shock workers overfilling their production targets and so on. And a lot of if people have a kind of vague idea of Soviet industrial propaganda, propaganda posters of chimney smoke and smelting and so on, it's probably related to Donbas. And one of the kind of founding films of Donbas and of that version of it is Enthusiasm by Dziga Vertov, the great Dziga Vertov, the man behind Man with a Movie Camera, which I'm sure many people have heard of. If you studied film, you will have had to watch Man with a Movie Camera many times over. This kind of pioneering avant-garde non-fiction filmmaker. And he made film at the beginning of the 1930s about Donbas and about the industry there, called Enthusiasm. The subtitle is Symphony of the Donbas, a Donbas symphony. So yeah, this is a really interesting film, and I think it's worth getting into because, yeah, like I say, it speaks so much to these cliches, but I think it's a lot more interesting than just a kind of propagandistic cliche-ridden film. So I mean, how would you describe Enthusiasm and the image of Donbas that it creates, and why is that a kind of interesting, problematic, kind of foundational film for the region?
Yeah, I mean, you say students study Man with a Movie Camera. So I make my students study this film actually in my film course. I don't think it's a particularly well-known one from Vertov's oeuvre. It's I think one of his less critically acclaimed films, and it's a bit sort of bumpy. The structure is maybe not as neat as some of his other films, but yeah, I teach it because obviously it is this really iconic work that establishes a lot of these kind of propaganda myths, or like consolidates them about the region. I suppose, well, it was produced it was released in 1931, and in 1931, I think it was 1931, there was also this very iconic propaganda poster about Donbas, which I often talk about, which depicts the region. You've probably seen it as a beating heart,
Yeah.
pumping its lifeblood in the form of coal to all of the different regions of what was becoming the Soviet Union, from kind of Riga in the north to Vladivostok in the far east of Russia, down to Baku in the south. And it kind of really imagines Donbas as this sort of vital organ within this broader, like, kind of political body that was this kind of emerging Soviet Union, this kind of multinational communist state. And I think that idea of Donbas as a vital organ within this larger kind of body is one that really pertains throughout the Soviet period, and one that kind of still continues to inform the Putinist imagination of the region today as something very integral to, the inherited state of the Soviet Union, today's Russian Federation. And I think Vertov's film in many ways is sort of the cinematic version of that propaganda poster. It sort of establishes, using all of those really iconic Vertov tropes of kind of documentary filmmaking, but with this avant-garde experimental lens, and the beautiful kind of sort of constructivist angles that he uses, and the sort of sublime kind of camera work that really presents these like iconic elements of industry, like the chimney stacks in the factories, or the blast furnaces, almost as the new cathedrals, shooting them from the bottom and showing them rising, ascending in this kind of almost religious way to the heavens. It really kind of is a love letter to the kind of Stalin's first 5-year plan, and this idea of industry being the thing that's going to propel the country forward in the drive to build communism. And so from that point of view, it's iconic. As you say, sort of looking at it from the point of view of what we now know about heavy industry, and how this region was then sort of fetishized as a cultural stereotype. It's problematic. It's politically problematic, as you say. But it's fascinating to study in terms of how this myth came to be established and how it came to be circulated around the huge kind of multinational empire that was the Soviet Union.
Which, and on that, Vertov
Uh,
was Polish. He was
yeah,
Polish, Jewish.
yeah.
He was kind of a doubly outside
Hmm.
of both Russia and Ukraine. Although he did a lot of
Hmm.
him and his brothers did a lot of their work in Ukraine. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that I also, back when I was teaching film, I also used to make my students watch Enthusiasm because I think it's a fantastic film, and you've described really
Mm.
well the ways in which Vertov kind of uses his filmmaking talent to create this kind of rapturous
Hmm.
vision of industry. But what's really interesting about it is that it's like one of the first sound films
Hmm.
in the Soviet Union, and Vertov was one of these few directors who really tried to use this new technology of sound film in an interesting way, to not
Hmm.
just kind of go straight to kind of synchronous sound and dialogue and so on. He really was interested in experimenting with it and being kind of contrapuntal in his use of sound. And I think he saw this kind of world of heavy industry as like a great entry point into that, because it allowed
Hmm.
him to kind of, the soundtrack is really,
Mm.
you know, strange to even now, kind of
Yeah.
how we're nearly like 90 years later or something, right?
Yeah.
It's this kind of non-synchronized use of these kind of rhythmic industrial
Mm.
soundscapes. And, a lot of people at the time, a lot of critics at the time kind of lambasted him for it.
Hmm.
I've got the quote here for what Vertov said in response to these critics saying, it was just a kind of monotonous cacophony and it didn't make any sense. And then he
Hmm.
said in response, "I refuse to become like those novelists who praise the Donbas while turning away from it and shutting their delicate noses and eyes and ears. I lived the sounds of Donbas and I wrote the film with the voices of machines, of shock workers, and the sounds of radio telegraph messages." So, he
Hmm.
clearly thought that he was kind of celebrating this unique character, and he clearly thought that cinema and this new tool of sound cinema was
Hmm.
perfectly suited, was to kind of
Hmm.
see symbiotic
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. You almost know when something gets described as a monotonous cacophony that it's going to be good, right? That's one of when it gets reviewed that way in some Soviet journal, it's probably the good stuff.
So yeah, we have Enthusiasm, which is this, like, say, this foundational Donbass film, and
Hmm.
it's a non-fiction film, propagandistic but non-fiction. And one thing that's really interesting in the book is you talk about how Donbass was the subject of this kind of endless documentary production over the rest of the Soviet period. Like, this was like an aspect of Donbass cinema that kept going all the way
Hmm.
throughout, because it was the site of so much kind of propagandistic visual work. So could you maybe just tell us a bit about that history of Donbass as this endless site of documentary kind of investigation and celebration?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, before I decided to write this book, so I wasn't writing this book at the time the full-scale invasions started in February 2022. I was writing a more academic, kind of straighter academic book, which was focused on a visual history of Donbass. And in the book that I had in mind before I kind of pivoted and decided to write this book, I was going to write each chapter from the region's history through the lens of a particular kind of visual culture. And in the late Soviet period, the kind of the visual form that I had in mind was the worker portrait, because there were so many portraits of these kind
Mm.
of Stephanovite workers that were made at this time. So you mentioned Stakhanovism and the sort of movement of Stakhanovism, which was about the cult of overproduction in
Yeah, we
all
should
realms.
maybe mention. I think maybe it's we should mention to people who aren't Soviet history nerds like us,
Yeah.
Stakhanovism was
Mm.
this kind of, I guess, kind of culture and labor phenomenon in the Soviet Union, starting in the 1930s, but kind of going on a lot longer, based
Mm-hmm.
around the kind of myth of this. He was a miner, right, in
Mm-hmm.
Donbas. Alexei Stakhanov,
Mm-hmm.
I want to say,
Alexei, yeah. Mm-hmm.
who had kind of massively overfilled his production quota and was kind of held up as this, a propagandistic symbol of the perfect Soviet laborer, and it produced this kind of endlessly recursive discourse about the ideal worker. Sorry, that was just
Yeah.
a cut in there to just mention who we're
No, that's
referring to
helpful.
when we say Stakhanovism.
But the whole kind of myth of Stakhanovism, which kind of emerges, as you say, from this region and from the cult figures who were marketed to the country as these heroes of labor overproduction, was really something that then defined the culture of work in the country, and this idea that everybody should be kind of striving to do more, to kind of excel in order to contribute to this project of building communism, which really defined working culture throughout, the 60s and 70s up until the late socialist era. And I just mentioned to you that while I was researching this chapter, I went to Pshenichny Archive in Kyiv in 2021, I think, and asked to see some of these portraits of Stakhanovite workers from Donbas, to kind of get a sense of like the visual genre. And the archivist brought out just boxes and boxes of these portraits, and you wouldn't believe until you see them actually physically how many of these portraits were produced. But not only portraits, there was also a lot of documentary film. And so during that trip to Pshenichny Archive, I had a chance to look at some of this documentary film that was produced about Stakhanov, but also about other sort of mini Stakhanovs who worked in other areas of industry, because, there was one in every industry that you went to. Local film studios would make these documentary films about these sort of local Stakhanovites, in order to try and enthuse people who worked in industry into working harder and producing more.
Yeah, so it's this. There is this body of visual work of film out there, just kind of
Mm,
creating this huge kind of propagandistic tapestry around
yeah.
Donbass, but which does nonetheless obviously like reveal real people,
Mhm,
real lives,
mhm.
like real
Yeah, I
real
mean, one of the
achievements.
things that's really interesting, I think, and for film buffs in particular, who I imagine listen to this podcast, is that a lot of the factories in Donbass had their own film studios.
Yeah, yeah,
So there are these local film studios, and the people who made films were often steel workers and people who worked in the industry. So it's amateur filmmaking. Another part of my work, I kind of do collaborative work, sort of digitally archiving some of those precarious collections in order to kind of bring them to broader audiences. And we've digitized a lot of the film archives from factories in eastern Ukraine, and a lot of them are now available through the Urban Media Archive at the Center for Urban History in Lviv. So you can search that archive and see what film is available there. And as you say, they're really interesting because they're partly that sort of typical propagandistic way of depicting industry, as you would expect, like a sort of different, sort of maybe less experimental version of Vertov's filmmaking. But other kinds of filmmaking that were happening there were really unexpected. Like there's a lot of kind of people were often interested in ecological themes, because working in a factory
yeah.
obviously was heavily polluting, and particularly in the late socialist period, a lot of the filmmaking that the factory workers did was going to the forests, going to rivers and filming animals, insects, plants. And so that sort of proto-eco-critical filmmaking is super interesting in the context of this heavily industrialized region, and maybe something that you wouldn't have expected to be going on at that time.
Yeah, and something you write about in the book as well, the emergence of this kind of Soviet ecological movement
Mm,
um, out of what it was emerging in lots of different places at the same time, but like at least in part out of this
mhm.
heavily polluting industrial zone. And you mentioned Mariupol there. We were just talking before we started recording that another Soviet era film before we get into the kind of post-Soviet period, which is a whole different set of cliches and tropes. One of the Soviet era films which is most famous, I think, in the former Soviet Union, and which really captures the character of a place in Donbas really well, but which would hardly ever, I think, be referred to as a Donbas film in inverted commas, is Vasily Pitchul's Little Vera, from the late 80s, which was this kind of succès de scandale in Perestroika era Soviet Union, because it was a film about kind of disaffected, cynical youth and generational conflict and kind of working class discontent, and it contained the first sex scene in Soviet film, and so on. It was a huge kind of commercial hit, and it kind of expressed this cynicism of late socialist kind of decline. But it's set in Mariupol, and it's very evocative of the shipyards and of the works there.
Yes, that's a really interesting film in terms of the different ways in which it's perceived inside and outside of Ukraine, or maybe even inside and outside of Mariupol. Because it was one of the films that had really kind of captured my imagination about Mariupol and really made me want to go there when I saw it for the first time. But I remember when I did go there and told somebody that I'd seen this film, they were really upset, and they said, oh, that film gave Mariupol a really bad name, as being this kind of post-industrial wasteland and also a place of like kind of inappropriate sexual behavior. But from my point of view, I was really interested in it because of, as you say, these sort of establishing shots of the steel works, which are showed as this kind of like fiery inferno on the horizon in this kind of industrial sublime tradition, or maybe not, maybe slightly sort of more dystopian than that. And then some of the really memorable shots of the teenagers in this derelict shipyard partying and re-inhabiting the sort of the derelict infrastructure of Soviet industry and bringing like a cachet and a cool to it with their kind of punk fashion and their kind of mischievous antics. But yeah, so it is definitely one of the films that's the sort of first films, I think, the earliest films that's like mainstream films that starts to kind of explore dereliction, and the way in which like a new generation is inhabiting those landscapes of dereliction and abandonment and bringing kind of a new cultural energy to them, which I think is present in some of the later filmmaking from that region as well. It doesn't feel exoticized. It feels like he understands how people kind of dwelt in those landscapes and how they interacted with these different kinds of spaces. So there's a familiarity with it, which I think makes it quite emotionally impactful.
Yeah, you're right. It's a kind of at least in terms of this discussion, it's a kind of useful bridge film because it obviously references back to what you just called there, like the industrial sublime of that kind of early Soviet, more propagandistic filmmaking, but it's this very cynical 80s kind of take on the decline of Soviet society. And it kind of like looks forward, I think, to a lot of the kind of dominant themes or ideas about the region in the post-Soviet period, which kind of moving forward, you get obviously like with the collapse of the Soviet system, there's a lot of issues like in South Wales, actually, if we want to go back and make that comparison again, like the withdrawal of the state, deindustrialization, the entrance of these kind of oligarchic interests. It creates a whole other kind of character and a whole other kind of set of cliches about the place. And you write a lot in the book, actually, about, this idea that even before, 2014, 2022, these kind of military escalations, that there was this character in Donbas, in these kind of post-industrial, deindustrialized places of, self-sufficiency that had been produced by this kind of need to just kind of get on with things in the face of kind of state withdrawal and the loss of kind of economic potential.
Yeah, so when I was doing my research in Donbas, in government-controlled Donbas, it was mostly between sort of 2019 and 2021. So my last visit to Eastern Ukraine before the full-scale invasion was to Mariupol in November 2021, so just a couple of months before that horrific siege that completely destroyed the town and displaced huge parts of the population and killed thousands of people. But yeah, at that time, between sort of 2019 and 2021, there was a real perceptible kind of culture of self-organization. And I think self-organization and particularly among sort of activist communities and who are often included cultural activists who'd been displaced from larger cities in what was then occupied Donbas, so from Donetsk and Luhansk, cultural activists who'd moved from those big cities to smaller municipalities like Severodonetsk or Bakhmut. There
Or
were
Mariupol at the time.
Mariupol was really well known as kind of a place where some activist groups had cohered, the free filmers who we'll talk about later. Mariupol was really well known within Donbas as being this hub of cultural activism at this time and this hub of self-organization. And, you know, lots of people who I met in the region and in Ukraine more generally were all talking about moving to Mariupol because there was such a scene there in terms of activism and filmmaking and culture and rave culture and a lot of, you know, sort of interesting developments. So it was clear that I think Donbass, whereas it had once been perceived as a cultural wasteland, by the eve of the full-scale invasion was one of the most dynamic cultural regions in the whole of Ukraine. People knew about and wanted to go to and wanted to see what was going on there. And this was partly because of the existential kind of problem of having like war so close. The war in the region had been going on already there for 8 years before the full-scale invasion. And so there was an urgency to doing something, you know, that wasn't just, you know, sort of dilettantish sort of cultural like expression, but actually politically engaged cinema making or kind of cultural organizing that could contribute to creating a different vision of the future for that region.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about free filmers, because this is a group that I was actually introduced to by you and your colleague Daria when you wrote a piece for Klassiki Journal a few years back, and who I've since kind of immersed myself in and interviewed myself. I find them a really inspiring and a really interesting, kind of like practice and idea. So free filmers is this kind of, I guess you call it a filmmaking collective. You can tell me how they would self-define, who kind of were born out of this, like you've just described, this kind of post-2014 period where the parts of Donbass still controlled by the Ukrainian government became very culturally vibrant with these displaced activists and artists. And this was a group, well, it still is a group, but they're no longer kind of able to be based in Mariupol, in Donbass. Have this filmmaking practice based on collective local engagement with kind of local histories and issues, and they made a lot of short form work that was really kind of embedded in these places. And tell us a bit about free filmers as kind of as these symbols of this period in which Donbass produced this kind of really vibrant kind of critical filmmaking culture.
Well, so I think I first encountered free filmers who I think they define themselves as an NGO, but they are a kind of anti-capitalist, like anti-imperialist filmmaking collective that's particularly interested in kind of creating work and collaborating to create work about marginalized communities, including working class communities, queer communities, and neurodiverse communities in Eastern Ukraine. As you say, they were sort of based in Mariupol or kind of partly based in Mariupol and other regions in the east before the full-scale invasion. I'd encountered their work online and was teaching some of their short films to students in my film classes. And I was, particularly interested in kind of the ethics of the film production and how they were. I think they probably, at least some members would identify as kind of decolonial in terms of the way in which they wanted to delink from some of these very hierarchical, sort of patriarchal practices of filmmaking and sort of outsider looking on the region, which we've already touched on in our conversation, and the way in which Eastern Ukraine has been sort of fetishized or reduced to a set of cultural stereotypes, which don't really include the lived experience and the embodied knowledge of what it means to come from that region. So they were very keen to kind of like feature filmmaking by people from the region, and also to work with people to kind of help them to develop skills to make films about their region. I mean, in a way, it links with what we were just talking about the kind of amateur filmmaking that was coming out of the factories, in the
Yeah.
way in which people were making films about themselves that didn't necessarily, that perhaps kind of borrowed and played with tropes from the kind of propagandistic Soviet era filmmaking, but then did wholly unexpected and for kind of an outsider like me and surprising things with like the tools of filmmaking that were available to kind of, you know, get into topics and issues that were central to life, but about which you might not know unless you came from that place. It's just a very kind of intimate portrayal of what it means to kind of grow up and live in a place like Mariupol. And I think, you know, gives you a very privileged insight into some of the aspects of life, which, you know, are often only presented in this like highly stylized way, as
Yeah.
like, as we talked about, either the industrial sublime or as like this kind of decrepit post-apocalyptic dwelling in a landscape of post-life that's almost kind of video game-ish in its aesthetics.
Yeah. I couldn't put it any better myself. And we'll include some links to the films of theirs that are freely available to watch online, so people can get a sense, because you really just have to just sit with the material. I think it's probably quite hard to do justice to it just verbally. So yeah, we'll include some links to that as well. So I think we've kind of skirted the topic of the war since 2014, not avoiding it, but I think in kind of following the lead of your book, not wanting to kind of be reductive of this region to the conflict that's kind of devastated it. But, you know, obviously a lot of the film that is produced about Donbas now is bound up with the war on all sides. You know, one could find whatever narratives one wanted in cinema about Donbas now. But one film I thought would be good to just use as an example of this kind of conflict cinema about Donbas is Dmitry Moiseyev's film Grey Bees, which I think is I think captures a lot of what you've said about Donbas, and maybe captures how the idea of Donbas has changed since the full-scale invasion. So this is an adaptation of quite a celebrated Ukrainian novel by Andrei Kurkov from 2018. It's an adaptation. I mean, it changes details of the novel as well. The film is about these two pensioners, former miners in this village in Donbas. The village is in what's called the grey zone, basically like between areas controlled by Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed forces, separatist forces. And these two pensioners are the only people remaining in the village. They're the only people who've stuck around. Basically, everyone else has left, has evacuated. And it's about the relationship between these two men and their relationship to the place and to the conflict and the question of, I guess, kind of survival and collaboration and the question of choosing sides and so on. And it's really interesting in the way it kind of like, it dwells in the greyness of the title of the grey zone, whilst also not, it refuses to reduce this place, even though it's, you know, a landscape kind of ravaged by war. It refuses to reduce it to that, and it really insists on like these personal histories and these emotional histories of the place. So how do you see a film like Grey Bees as kind of indicative of maybe where Donbas cinema is at the moment in the context of the full-scale war?
Well, I mean, I read Andrei Kurkov's book before I saw this film, and as you say, the timeline of the film is quite different to the timeline of the book. So I think the way that the film tells a story is it's almost kind of on the eve of the full-scale invasion, and the big war
Yeah.
is coming, and the two men are kind of stubbornly or resiliently kind of remaining in the place that they've lived all their lives, as kind of the troops build. But I think, one of the things that really struck me watching that film was the way in which both the book and the film really get into the intimacies of kind of life in proximity to war and some of the reasons why people would choose to stay rather than go. That's something I also write about in my book. So one of the things I wanted to do in my book was really to include some of the voices of the people who come from that region. And I think a lot of the people who've made films about Donbas have also tried to do that in different ways. And one of the people, so in the book, I tried to kind of include people, tell their history in kind of conversation with them, but also include their voices directly, and have them contribute short texts, which are interspersed with the chapters in my book. And one of the chapters was, one of these interchapters was provided by a director of a museum in Pokrovsk, called Angelina Rozhkova, who also chose to stay in Pokrovsk almost on the front line at the moment that the full-scale war was approaching the city, and up until the point that the city was evacuated in 2024. And in her text, she writes about the reasons why she wanted to stay. And she writes about the fact that as a museum director, it was really important for her to stay with her collections, with her museum, because cultural heritage has to stay in the place which it matters most. And I found her words really profound and touching in that essay that she wrote for the book. And the reason I mention that is because Grey Bees also sort of turns over the same ideas and the same subject matter. So one of the reasons why one of the main characters decides to stay, or it's presented as one of the reasons, is because he's a beekeeper and he looks after these bees who are kind of in an outbuilding in his house. And so to leave that place would be not only to abandon these creatures in his care, but also if he's to leave, then he leaves not only the place that he comes from and his property and his life, but he also leaves his identity, and he can't take that identity with him as a beekeeper. You have to remake yourself anew when you're displaced from the place that you come from, not only in kind of material terms, but also in kind of cultural and psychological terms. You have to reinvent yourself, and that is in itself a huge trauma, almost more, I don't want to say more or less, but it can be as traumatic as kind of staying in the proximity of a really destructive and damaging war. And so I think the film is very interesting in the way that it slowly turns over that kind of thought process and the decisions that could stand behind the reasons that people stay. And doing the research for my book, obviously I know people who stayed behind in kind of now occupied Donbas, or stayed on the frontline territories for really different reasons. So I think, the film is a really interesting exploration of that through these kind of two characters who stay in this gray zone and choose not to move away from what might look like, the most uninhabitable region. So I think from that point of view, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it also presents, if not a hopeful vision of the future, but at least one in which there is moral clarity, which I think is also really important. And I think we should probably leave it there. Victoria Donovan, thanks so much for joining us. The book is Life in Spite of Everything: Tales from the Ukrainian East. We'll include some links by this book. It's a fantastic book. I learned a lot, and it really gave me renewed appreciation for Ukrainian cultural history, but the cultural history of this region in particular. Victoria Donovan, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Sam.